top of my head, probably I think the 30s. What's the earliest? I can't remember now.
There's one from the 40s, it's the Eiffel Tower, the American flag.
Oh, maybe it is the 40s, yeah. There were some earlier things on other legs. There was the Schwitters from the 20s that's not here. So yeah, probably about the 40s onward. But eventually, you know, what we're trying to do with the collection is also is to go, you know, further back, even to Victorian collage, which we actually have recently gotten some gifts of some early things that are more, kind of, let's say, kind of folk art, because I do think it's important to sort of trace this move from that which was not considered fine art, but was still very much that today we wouldn't question as legitimate works of art.
Cheese bend quilts.
Cheese bend quilts, right?
Talk about
perfect example. Yeah.
A question that I have related to this issue of time, or the time in the sense of how you absorb it and interpret it, would be we typically understand collage as being more additive and an aggregative process, and most of these examples that we see here, I think, are pretty materially dense, and it may be in part because of how the exhibition was hung that, you know, sometimes your attention is drawn to some of the more reductive pieces, and particularly for me, the Alice Addie pair in the back corner here. And I think, you know, artists like Moholy-Nagy, Marion Brandt, and I think Joseph Cornell also, their work tends to be kind of more reductive or more restrained in their use of these image fragments. And, you know, with using the Addie pieces as an example, the negative space is so powerful. And I thought there was certainly a correlation between that type of collage making technique with your work, Brian. And if you could talk a little bit more about that kind of precision and reductive approach to collage making.
Which two are you talking
The
about?
two in the back left, the top.
In general, the more minimal.
How are those made? Are those?
They're Baedeker maps collaged along the very bottom, so the rest is just picture. The rest of the picture surface is just the paper. So it's really about activating the negative space of the paper.
Or we could talk about negative space.
I could work my way into an answer on that, but I don't.
It doesn't have to be about your specific work. I'm just, to me, that's you know, a
the
really
additive
interesting.
versus subtractive nature of.
I think our intuitive understanding of collage is that it is very dense and additive, and so to see examples where it is more reductive.
I think again it
and
has to do with the
subtractive.
collage and montage for me.
Okay.
And I think that I've worked specifically in digital form. And Andrew comes from an upbringing of working with physical objects. And so I remember the night before the Charlotte show went up, going to his house and seeing, I mean, the Xerox machine is one of his greatest allies in collecting fragments of Michelangelo's sculpture, or T.S. Eliot's kind of graph paper that he took notes on, and the meaning of each of these sources, and seeing a dining room that had basically been transformed with clippings. Like, that's something that I don't think many students work with in terms of that difference between collage and montage. And that's why I'm truly overwhelmed when you look at the way in which, I mean, the hair and the rose petals, or the nature of the objects and the string that gets cut down. And that process, and I can only imagine, you were talking about the studio of the woman for Katrina, who, in sort of her source material and what her studio looked like. That's something that I think is unfortunate, that I think if we had next to every one of these a picture of the artist's studio, or the artist in process, a small video. When it comes to collage, when you think of painters, I mean, when you get to actually see the emotion that goes into that, or the way the exercise or physical exertion, that's very, very interesting. And so, I don't know in terms of additive or subtractive, but I think for me, I would say it's a more additive technique, perhaps, working digitally, montage, whereas this may be a more subtractive, being in kind of a bin of stuff and trying to sort your way through these kind of fragments.
The editorial process.
So, I mean,
But it takes some patience to let go of things that, you know, I mean, in making, it's helpful to work on 10 pieces at one time because you don't feel that impulse that you have to put some, you know, glue something down here when, you know, you can put your attention somewhere else if you can't find the right thing you want to say. Really, it's about looking for the thing you want to say. So, I mean, time equals space, so you have to sort of distance yourself, I think, too, from what you're making at times in order to understand what it is you're trying to say with it.
but do you think that in graphic design, that, I mean, I imagine the same way when we used to do portfolios, everything was rub-on letters, and it's amazing that 20 years ago, the way in which a portfolio was generated, pre-InDesign. But I assume in graphic design, this idea of layout and cutting and pasting, that there was, I mean, it's the same objects that are created in terms of composition and image, but the process is, in time and speed is changing dramatically. Maybe that's not different, but it seems like in graphic design it would absolutely be
Yeah, it's hugely different, but there's good and bad in that, right? Because you could never make 10 ideas at one time before, and then discard 9 and choose one of those versions to use, you know? So I think the options of permutations now is a great thing. It's a good thing. I mean, I wish I had that 20 years. I mean, I'd love to see what some of these designers who are working without a computer and making such wonderful statements, you know, 30 years ago would do now, right? With the techniques and the technology that's available. But yeah, the problem, I think it's just no matter what you do, you have to slow down, and that's a difficult process for all of us. I mean, I remember what it's like cutting movie lists and rubbing down type and counting characters across, you know, a typewritten page to tell somebody else how to set it. You know, that was all, you know, huge time consumption, right? But now I fall into the same process that all the students do. You know, I'm on my computer and I'm working just as fast, you know. Fortunately, maybe I have the benefit of that, but I forget that sometimes and write here in the present.
We might be, I'm a little confused. I think we might be conflating this idea of speed with the time you spend with the work. I think that was how it was originally introduced, or maybe the way you make it, but I don't know if it's totally safe to say digital's fast, analog is slow. That's not true. I mean, it's just totally not true. Like, paintings happen fast. I do paintings fast sometimes. And digitally,
Good
I mean,
paintings.
yeah, I do good paintings fast. But I mean, like, everything I do is good. No, like, I think sometimes the digital stuff, you know, half a second of one of those animations that you watch in the theater, it's uncanny how many 65 people it took, you know, 3.5 weeks to make the mountains or something, you know? So I don't know if it's totally, I don't know, I think we might be conflating what we were talking about, looking at a piece, and that I think is a really interesting and difficult problem, is that when it's digital, you're
You don't
somehow
get
less
that.
likely to spend time.
Yeah.
Or, yeah, like it's
Well,
harder.
you don't
to-
get it in the finished product.
You don't,
That's the
totally.
difference.
You assume they pressed the mountain button.
Yeah. And there was the mountain.
Yeah, and then people flew over it, yeah.
Yeah, I think that I think the difference is when you look at a painting, for example, and you see a surface that clearly has been built up layer after layer and so on, and you can read that as a viewer in the picture. And in a lot of digital work, yes, even and particularly when you see, for example, an animated film, I mean, there are countless hours and people involved in doing the kinds of things that Pixar or whoever does. I agree that the time thing can vary. But in terms of the perception of the
Right.
work, I think that's very real, and I think that it changes the way. The way you process it. I mean, one of the things I love about doing a show like this is that it sort of demands of the viewer a level of engagement that makes you think about things like, you know, kind of minimal gestures versus additive. I mean, that's really, in a way, what I took your last question to mean, this idea about, you know, collage is not something we often associate with minimalism as a movement, and certainly minimalism as a sensibility. I did a show in the gallery several months back, called Minimal Intervention, and it included Alice Addy, for example, Robert Courtwright, and some of these artists who take a decidedly reductive approach to collage. And in the same way that yesterday I made this point that with regard to scale, because I think that one of the hardest things to do successfully in collage is work on a monumental scale and still preserve that sense of intimacy that you want from works of art, that kind of connectedness. And I think equally so, it seems very simple, like this Michael Cooper collage that's hanging above in the white frame, and it's basically 10 found fragments that are the numbers 1 through 10. They're all